This is Conspirinormal.
Okay, guys, welcome back to Conspirinormal. It's Adam, and Serfiel is also with me.
And we have one of our favorite friends of the show, returning guest, Recluse.
Yes, sir.
Snider.
Yes, sir. Recluse is back for the third time this year. I guess technically fourth time this year, considering he was also a speaker at Strange Realities this year. So welcome back, Stephen.
Well, thank you guys very much for having me back again for a third or fourth time, whichever we're going with.
Yeah, we're going to talk about your book, A Special Relationship. And this is a very interesting book. We've been expecting it for a little while, and it's actually the first, I guess, in a trilogy that surrounds the Jeffrey Epstein story. But the subtitle of this is A Special Relationship, Trump, Epstein, and the Secret History of the Anglo American Establishment. So, Stephen, I'll ask you this to kind of start off. What brought you to the curiosity to go ahead and write this book?
Well, I mean, it really, went into something that, we're going to talk about later, but that was just seeing the extensive amount of family ties between some of the individuals who showed up in Epstein's Black Book and many of the families that were implicated in the Profumo Affair. And I've usually been the kind of person to dismiss a lot of the, kind of multi-generational speculations about sex rings and that type of thing. But after looking at that topic, I mean, it was just, or these connections, it was just really, really fascinating to me. I wrote a couple of blogs about that back when the Epstein thing really started to get big again in 2019. And it just kind of occurred to me, well, why not do it as a book? I kept coming up with more and more interesting, leads, so I might as well get paid for it ultimately. And then, of course, it got started. As I was telling you guys before we started recording, it was originally supposed to be one book, but, after about 2 chapters, I was about 30,000 words in. So I was like, okay, this is going to, rival War and Peace, like 2,000 words or something. So probably to make it more digestible to the broader audience, maybe go with just a trilogy.
So now you are directly competing with Dr. Future on who can get the trilogy out faster.
I'll definitely beat Doc Future on that. I'm a very prolific writer, if nothing else.
All right, so you call the book, you use a term in there called special relationship. And what is the special relationship? What do you mean by that term?
Well, it's interesting, of course, we always hear about the storied special relationship between the U.S. and the U.K. And when I began researching this project, I found out that that really wasn't even a thing until the Second World War. Really up to that point in time when many Americans thought of a European nation that the United States had a special relationship with, it was typically France. France, of course, we were brothers in democracy. They had declared their republic shortly after the American Revolution. They had supported us in the American Revolution, and we had always had that kind of bond. But going into the Second World War, there was the strong isolationist movement in the United States, and the special relationship, or the concept of it, was essentially something that was constructed by British propagandists, especially those centered around the British Security Coordination, which was the principal intelligence service in North America for the Brits. They came up with this whole concept of a special relationship as a means of political warfare effectively in this country. So that was kind of the genesis of what we would now think of as the special relationship, though, of course, there had been this kind of ongoing attempt by American elites and British elites towards the end of late 19th century, the early 20th century, to forge closer bonds with the country. But, this whole process really didn't kick into high gear until the eras of the 2 world wars.
So would that be kind of similar to this kind of, one of the big conspiracy villains is the Round Table group, like Cecil Rhodes and the Round Table group? Would that be kind of would that be something that would be a part of the special relationship?
Oh, yes, absolutely. Though it should be pointed out, though, there was an even more exclusive club, an earlier club to an Anglo American Fellowship, one known as the Pilgrims Society. That one's very rarely addressed. I really have to give a tip of the hat to the Institute for the Study of Globalization and Covert Politics. Joel, the longtime curator there, is really one of the only individuals who's ever attempted to chronicle the Pilgrim Society. But that was really kind of the genesis of this, intertwinement between the kind of aristocracies of the US and the UK. And in a lot of ways, Quigley's whole roundtable group was kind of an outgrowth of that, and in the UK what was known as the Cecil Block. So, but yes, it is, to answer your question, it is a part of that, but it wasn't the only, player in this whole shenanigans, so to speak.
So you, in the first chapter, you give this extensive background of what this nature of the special relationship is. You talk about some of the different kinds of ideas that were bandied about by the people in the special relationship. And you got two schools of thought that you talk about, and that is internationalism versus Pax Americana, which kind of, in a way, if you see those words, it kind of is obvious what they're talking about. But what do you kind of mean by this internationalism versus the idea of an American peace?
Well, I mean, it was really it goes back to the founding of our country and the two different visions that were present at the time, after the revolution. You had kind of the Federalist vision, which sought closer ties with UK and of course with the other European powers. And then conversely, you had the kind of Jeffersonian vision that eventually, crystallized as manifest destiny throughout the 19th century, and this kind of gradual expansion westward and so forth. And as time went on, eventually they did sort of morph into these two different ideologies of a Pax Americana and versus this sort of more internationalist and later globalist ideology. The globalist one really derived from the old sort of Federalist vision. It was obviously centered in the same region of the country, in New York and the tri-state areas and so forth, and was largely driven by the banking powers and that type of thing. And then on the flip side of the coin, manifest destiny, I mean, it never really went away. It kind of continued on and on. There was a bit of a lull, I guess, after the Civil War, but it was massively rekindled with the administration of William McKinley. Of course, this is at the late 19th century. By this point in time, there was no more West in these United States, at least. The closing of the West, I think, was officially in 1892 or something like that. So where do you go from there? And the answer was we would continue forging ahead into the Pacific and would try to bring more and more of the rest of the world under the American banner. And this was always sort of driven by this, fanatical desire, with the destiny of the United States to spread democracy all over the world and so forth, though it did ultimately deteriorate into a very imperialistic vision. And this is very much the genesis of America First. Of course, when we look at these groups like that from the World War II era, they're always described as isolationists, but that's not really accurate. What a lot of these groups were always opposed to was entanglement with the European powers, close ties with the European powers, and then later the League of Nations and that type of thing. They really had no problem with military intervention so long as it was focused into the Pacific and the westward expansion.
Right. So, and then you have this whole idea of internationalism, which is much more this thing that comes out, I guess, after World War II, like the Bretton Woods Agreement, kind of like an economic unity of the world, essentially.
Yeah. Well, also too, even within the internationalist camp, as I kind of get into in the book, there were two competing schools. You had sort of the Theodore Roosevelt camp, which is what we would now think of as today's neocons. They also sort of embraced this more of America First mentality, though they were more open to relations with the British than some of their counterparts in sort of the isolationist camp, if you will. But and then on the other hand, obviously you had sort of Quigley's round Round Table group that was fueling the more of the globalist internationalist vision, which eventually became a full-blown globalism after the Second World War. And this is where we got the United Nations and all that kind of stuff, though. I've always kind of said this, but I mean, how serious a lot of these different camps really were about the UN and that, whole sort of school was highly debatable. But certainly it was something that did have a lot of appeal to the business interests, but maybe not so much the military faction, I guess, if you will, the more conservative group that was centered around the War Department and then later the Pentagon. And then, of course, the isolationist camp never really wanted anything to do with this kind of global network that the Wall Street interests were fascinated by.
Right. And you talk a little bit about, which is actually a book that I have here, The Wise Men. And these are guys like Averell Harriman and some of these people that have really, like George Kennan, I think was another one that really influenced kind of like at least American policy all the way into the Cold War and kind of really set the parameters of the Cold War, the idea of containment of the Soviet Union and all these type of things. So how does that, relate to Great Britain and what's going on there?
Well, this camp really grew out of Theodore Roosevelt's School of Foreign Policy, which was really adamant about America first. A lot of these guys were brought into the War Department by Henry Stimson, Skull and Bonesmen, and as I'm sure you guys are aware, I mean, obviously the Wiseman camp did have a fair amount of Bonesmen in it. Harriman was a Bonesman, and I believe one or two of the other ones were McCloy, maybe. I can't remember off the top of my head, but these guys were essentially kind of the descendants of the modern day neoconservative movement. Of course, they were Democrats in this era. They came into government during the administration of FDR, and they would continue to wield a tremendous amount of power throughout Truman's administration, and then later in Kennedy's administration, and also to some extent in Eisenhower's as well. But their descendants, kind of with people like Paul Nitze and so forth, eventually departed and kind of served as the genesis of the neocon movement in the mid-'70s after the kind of realignment within the Democratic Party. But these guys, they had a complex relationship with the UK. Many of them were quite Anglophilic. But in the era in the 1950s, the early 60s, when their influence really was at their peak, they were not especially game to try to keep the British Empire afloat. This was sort of where this really hardcore, I think, American sentiment came through. A lot of these guys saw the kind of anti-colonial movement that began to emerge in the aftermath of the Second World War is a great way to push out the old European powers in a lot of regions of the world that previously had been closed to the United States, especially the Middle East, which everybody knew was going to be tremendously strategically important because of the oil reserves. So it was a great way, to try to get an American influence in a lot of these regions of the world that previously we had really been denied to. Now, these guys would reverse course later, but in that kind of particular era, they were kind of at the forefront of trying to break the British and ultimately kind of European stranglehold on a lot of areas of the world.
But then also the British really looked towards that new Pax Americana post World War II. While their empire is waning, they really looked to our foreign policy future entanglements as a way to channel and continue some of their interests.
Yeah, well, I mean, a lot of the old, guard British establishment, I mean, they had come up, with the whole round table movement, and they thought that inevitably they had to continue with their wagon hitched to the United States, even though there was a lot of dispute, I guess, among some of the younger generation. It's kind of interesting, but I mean, on the far right of the Tory party, the British Conservative Party, in this era at least, there was a lot of support for the European Union. They kind kind of saw it as a means of potentially, creating an independent power base for the UK outside of American influence. Of course, the UK did have a lot of prestige at this time in Western Europe because of their role in the Second World War. And it was kind of thought that, maybe, this would be the next coming thing. Maybe we shouldn't align ourselves too closely with American destiny, especially since the US really was adamant about dismantling the British Empire when it was expedient for us in regions of the world where we wanted influence. So, it was definitely, a bit of a power struggle there. And I think that was kind of something that later played into with Profumo, though ironically, the same kind of group of far-right Tories would ultimately side with some of the most, militantly Pax Americanist Americans later in their efforts to dislodge their government.
So you speak about, before we go on to kind of why it's important to understand all this, you talk about this two groups, WCC and the BACC. So what's their importance to this kind of the special relationship?
Well, essentially, the World Commerce Corporation and its sister outfit, the British American Canadian Corporation, were both set up really in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War. And effectively, they were used to stash a lot of the assets from the American and British intelligence services that were being shuttered at the time. We were going into this great era of lasting peace and, so on and so forth. And theoretically, we didn't need these intelligence services. And of course, there were also a lot of interagency rivalries playing out on both sides of the Atlantic. MI6 despised the Special Operations Executive, which was one of the big British intelligence services that was shuttered. And they were also the guys, the SOE, who had a lot of the expertise in special operations. So there was a general sense that these guys would be very valuable in the post-war years. And of course, in the United States, the Pentagon and the FBI had long despised the Office of Strategic Services, the OSS. It was shuttered. Again, all of this quote-unquote priceless talent was now out on the street. It was kind of thought that we needed some way that we could, set these guys up until cooler heads prevailed in theory, and they would be brought back into official government capacities. So that was at least the initial ideal for the World Commerce Corporation. But it was a little different, obviously, in the British side of things. There was already a big, entrenched intelligence service there in MI6. The SOE guys, they were not going to be able to take over that outfit the way the OSS guys were able to do with the CIA when it was established, because there really wasn't, any kind of predecessor other than the OSS there to compete with. So, definitely there was a different situation. And that's kind of why ultimately I think the World Commerce Corporation network was so much more important in the UK. Because the OSS guys, they had the ability to basically co-opt the CIA totally by the Eisenhower administration. And that just really, was not going to happen in the UK for obvious reasons.
So with all this background, Stephen, why is it important to understand both the Profumo Affair and Epstein? Why is that background important to those two?
Well, it's important because, I think ultimately with both Profumo and, especially with Epstein, a lot of this unfolds against the backdrop of what is effectively private intelligence networks with the, official governments of both the US and UK only having nominal control at best over them. And this is something that I think, in the UK, it's really been an ongoing problem since the end of the Second World War. Here, it really became a major issue getting into the Carter administration. But you have all of these spooks. They create these, vast private fiefdoms, a lot of times that have blackmail rings and arms trafficking and narcotics trafficking. And all of this stuff is very lucrative and it's very compromising. And when you fire these guys, from MI6 or the CIA or whatever, these, fiefdoms, they just don't disappear. They still continue. And now you have these guys that are almost totally outside of any government control running them still. And, what happens if they decide that they're going to reorient the country in a direction that they think that it should be going in? Well, it means that the democratic process is totally short-sighted, by these private actors. I mean, I think that's very much, a legacy of what we're seeing here in the United States, especially with the Cambridge Analytica stuff. This is the end result, I think, of just decades and decades of these private intelligence networks and the damage that they have done to both of these countries.
Right, and their wealth can be measured not only by the actual wealth that they make, usually through the types of shady things you talked about, but just the fact that information is probably some of the most valuable things in the world, especially compromising information that can get people in line with an agenda. I mean, if you look at it that way, these are, the power just exponentially increases.
And, and it's, like I said, and that's also the significance is there is so much overlap with a lot of this stuff. I mean, with Epstein, obviously everybody focuses on the sex trafficking, which is important. But I mean, it seems like Epstein was also very heavily involved in arms trafficking, which in some ways is even more significant. And this is kind of something that I'm laying the foundation for in this first book, kind of going into sort of the entwinement of all of this and the figure of Julian Amery, who obviously we'll get to here in a little bit.
Yeah, that's definitely a good point about Epstein. I think that there's no doubt in my mind or in any of our minds that he had some kind of ties to intelligence as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that he's probably a triple agent, just like his girlfriend's dad was a triple agent.
And that's the other thing. I mean, when you have all of these private actors, out there, who are they loyal to ultimately?
Right.
I mean, a lot of times these guys end up having dealings with multiple security services. And, in the case of, again, when we look at kind of the sprawl around Cambridge Analytica, I mean, you've got people from U.S. intelligence services, UK intelligence services, the Israelis, the Russians, private contractors like Eric Prince. I mean, it's just a whole smorgasbord of different interests involved in this kind of stuff.
Yes. Very, very much so. Kind of setting the background, though, for this, for Profumo, which we will get to, everyone. There's a little bit of a hit in this special relationship when you come to the Suez crisis. And a little bit of a change, kind of the attitude of the United States to the British and to the British Empire. And you've also got like the coup against Mossadegh that happens in 1953. The American support for Nasser, which plays right into the Suez crisis. So there's going to be like a little bit of a split here within the special relationship. And you kind of maintain in the book that later on there's a reorientation of the special relationship.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think specifically between the American right and later the British right. And I mean, again, kind of going back to the Second World War, I mean, the America Far Right, the America First Committee, I mean, they, despised the British and for good reason. I mean, Sir William Stevenson, I mean, it just absolutely destroyed them while he was here running British intelligence operations. That's kind of interesting in light, obviously, what we're seeing now with the current election. Again, when you want to talk about election rigging in this country, I mean, Stevenson was really the guy who wrote the book on it. I mean, hiring protesters to harass public figures, planning false stories, using prostitutes to sexually entrap prominent American politicians. I mean, these were all things that Stevenson, absolutely pioneered. And, kind of going back to what I was saying, I mean, it was all of this, really, I mean, a lot of private stuff that was being done here. But yeah, I mean, it is just so fascinating in light of like what we're seeing unfolding now. And I mean, how all this is sort of played out now in this country for decades in kind of this gradual escalation to the current cluster. I guess I shouldn't say cluster F on the air for you guys, but currently what we're certainly seeing right now in the aftermath of the 2020 election.
Yeah. And it's okay to curse here if you really need to. It's perfectly all right because it is a cluster F for sure. A lot of things are a cluster F right now. That's for damn sure. So I mean, the Suez crisis, just briefly. I mean, that's the U.S., the Britain and France and the Israel. Basically given a pretext to just like stay in the Suez Canal, which was an important important for Britain because that's where its oil was shipped through, and by that time India is already out of the British Empire, but that's because of a pretty important turning point.
Yeah, well, I mean, that was pretty much, the full-blown end of the British Empire there. And it was a bizarre set of circumstances. Of course, you had this, this World Commerce Network I had been kind of outlining previously, and they were, basically at odds with each other in Suez. You had the different British and American players squaring off against each other. Of course, you had Otto Skorzeny, the infamous Nazi commando who had been hired by Nasser to help train his security forces. He was part of this World Commerce, network. He was there, effectively trying to train the security forces for the Egyptians, while on the other hand, the British partners were trying to overthrow Nasser. Suez is just so strange in a lot of ways. I mean, it's, as far as I can even think of, it's one of the few times that the United States even openly moved against Israel, while they were using ex-Nazis nonetheless to, effectively support Nasser. But yeah, I mean, it was just utterly devastating for the British, and it had been kind of a gradual process of their loss of prestige in that whole region of the world. I mean, kind of going back to the, the coup in Iran earlier, that was actually something that had been started by what now, we know as British Petroleum and Oil Company, effectively, which had been threatened with nationalization. They had gotten MI6 involved, and then eventually we had tried to get the Americans in. It wasn't happening under Truman. Eisenhower was more, susceptible to this type of thing, but he wanted a cut of the oil. So we had to, or the UK had to grant major concessions to the US in that. And from there, we had just been gradually pushing the British further and further out of that region of the world. And that effectively climaxed with Suez. More or less, the British had been running up an enormous debt to fund their military operation there. They had asked the United States for a loan, and Eisenhower said no. And that basically was the end of the British Empire, at least officially, as they were forced to withdraw, and it became evident that, at least officially, they were unable to implement independent foreign policy without the United States' support in some form or other. But again, there was one man who at least had a vision for how they could move forward from that.
Yeah, so I mean, just to make a note about the Mossadegh. I mean, the Mossadegh coup. I mean, that's a big turning point as well, because Iran becomes essentially a satellite of the United States after that, at least till 1979. That's what kind of sets that countdown rolling to the Iranian Revolution. And then you also mentioned the Nazis working for Nasser, which you said one of them was Otto Skorzeny, who pops up literally everywhere in this time period. And interesting thing about Skorzeny is that not that long after that, the Israelis were actually employing him to go after German scientists that were working for Egypt.
Oh, yeah. And then, I mean, a few years after that, I mean, he was also helping the British, with some of their stuff in Yemen and what have you, which I'm sure we'll get to at some point here. And I think it reached the absolute absurdity with the Algerian war that the French were fighting, because, I mean, on the one hand, he was arming, I think, the FLN, while at the same token, he was trying to provide operational support to the French security forces. Skorzeny had an uncanny knack for playing both sides throughout the Cold War and making a lot of money in the process.
It's essentially Spectre, the James Bond, I mean, it really, I mean, and Skorzeny, like I said, I mean, he pops up everywhere, but
yeah. Do you guys remember that? What was it? 3 Days of the Condor, that 70s movie.
I've never seen it, but I know what you're talking about.
Oh, yeah, no, it's great. They have this, like, ex-Nazi. I don't think they ever actually say he's a Nazi, but he's like this commando guy, shaved head. At the beginning of the movie, he walks in and wipes out that whole CIA station or something. And basically, the whole movie, he's trying to kill the main character. And then at the end, if I'm not mistaken, he shows up, and the guy's like, "Are you going to kill me this time?" And he's like, No, I'm working for your side now. But that was basically, I mean, how a lot of these Nazis were kind of deployed in this, I mean, the whole war thing, and it was a lot more mercenary than people tend to.
Skorzeny also, one of his clients was also the communist branch of the PLO.
Oh yeah, well, I mean,
Yeah.
in the case of the thing with Nasser, I mean, it's like he was actually hiring like ex-Nazis from the Eastern Bloc of Germany. So I mean, these are guys like in the Communist Bloc he was like bringing over to fight for the U.S. I mean, like I said, just the whole thing with the Suez Crisis is just surreal on so many levels. I mean, it really is.
So you mentioned the person that was going to have a different idea, and I suppose that's probably Julian Amery. Okay, so I kind of what I written down here about the kind of the roles of not just him but his father Leopold as well.
Yes, Leopold Amery is just, he's a conspiracy theorist wet dream, though he's never really talked about. But I mean, he had just practically all of the bases covered. He was a big figure in Quigley's Round Table group. He was one of the trustees for the Road Trust for many years. He was effectively Lord Milner's successor as head of the group. He was also a Freemason. He was a Fabian socialist. He was a Zionist. In fact, he was probably one of the principal authors behind the Balfour Declaration, which laid the foundation for the creation of Israel.
He's got all the bases covered.
Yeah, I think about the only thing is I haven't found is that he wasn't a member of the Knights of Malta. That was really, there were no big Catholic groups that he was involved in. That was, I think, the only thing that he was really missing. But
had to have been in the Illuminati at one point.
Certainly.
Jesuit for sure.
No, yeah, I would think, either Jesuit, Knight of Malta. You would think it would be in there somewhere, but I haven't found it yet. But he certainly got around. He was a member of the Coefficients, just pretty much almost every other thing that you could think of, he was a member of. So, yeah, big guy, very powerful throughout really the first half of the 20th century in British government. Of course, he was a major backer of Churchill. He's most well known for basically slamming Chamberlain before the British Parliament. What was it? I believe he repeated the speech that had been given to Cromwell during the Long Parliament.
Was this the "For God's sakes, go"?
Yes. For all the good have you done, for too long have you sat in that chair, sir. Yes. So, and then yes, also the other time when Chamberlain had gotten up to speak for the Conservative Party, Amery had supposedly said "speak for England," which would later be used as a phrase for his biography. So he was quite a prominent member of British Parliament for many years. He was very close to Churchill. He was a major figure in the Round Table movement, certainly one of the most powerful and influential politicians of his era.
So he was a Fabian socialist, but he was also a nationalist.
Yes. Well, he did, in fairness, later break with the Fabian socialists effectively over his nationalism. I mean, he was first and foremost a die-hard imperialist. He was not going to let the empire go without a fight, that is for sure. And then, of course, he had two sons, both of whom are quite interesting. His oldest was John Amery. He has the distinct honor of being one of the only British subjects executed for treason in the aftermath of the Second World War. As I said before, Leopold was a Zionist. He was half Jewish. Both of his sons were a quarter Jewish. Despite this, John Amery became a fanatical Nazi. He was involved in arms trafficking for the Vichy regime in the interwar years for the Spanish Civil War. And then later he would become a full-blown propagandist for the Nazi regime. He was kind of the equivalent of Lord Hee-Haw, if you will. Mm-hmm. They were, recording him and then beaming his broadcasts into the UK and so forth. It was quite embarrassing, as obviously Leopold was a member of the British Parliament at the time, a close advisor to Churchill, and now his oldest son was being beamed into the UK to denounce the control of the Jews over the government. So yes, there no doubt would be a lot of interesting psychological profiles that could be done on John Amery. I even kind of attempted to do that a little bit in the book, going into the history of sexual abuse that he had experienced. Of course, later, while he was still a minor, he had effectively prostituted himself to wealthy men amongst the different European elites and so forth. So he had gotten into some pretty shady stuff. And then there was Leopold's youngest son, Julian, who would become essentially the preeminent coup master in British security services in the post-war years. Pretty much every major coup that the UK was involved in the 1950s and early 60s, Julian Amery was there, like some ragged, shadowy figure who lurked about the Middle East with a bag of cash in one hand. He shows up in Iran, he shows up in Egypt, he shows up in Yemen later on. He was in Cyprus, I believe, where he had MI6 procure sexual blackmail on the ruler to help ensure that the British got a favorable treaty when they decided to leave that area of the country, of the world. So he was a big player in a lot of this type of stuff. And then it kind of seems like going into the early 60s, he became obsessed with bringing a government to the UK that is, I believe Colin Wallace would say, had more resolve.
So he kind of had a different idea of how to like restructure the special relationship.
Yes. Well, I mean, he was also one of the guys who really kind of forged ties effectively with the American far right as well, potentially with Hoover, or Hoover's kind of faction within the American far right, which was remarkable because Hoover just despised the British going back to his dealings with Sir William Stevenson. They did not like each other, to put it mildly. And Hoover had maintained a lot of animosity towards the British and their security services for years afterwards. So, that in and of itself was quite a novel approach on Amery's part.
So we've set the background now, and now it's time to get into the juicy, kinky stuff. So to kind of set up the Profumo affair, you have these parties that are going on in London at the time that involve some of these people. And there's a guy that's kind of like, I guess you could call him a supplier of these girls, Stephen Ward. Yeah. So what is kind of his connections to that party and sex orgy scene?
But yes, he was, as I said, a society officer.
We need all the details for the listeners. Don't.
As our mutual friend Nathan from Penny Royal podcast says, helping them all eyes wide shut and shit.
Yeah, it was quite eyes wide shut. So Ward had actually gotten into British society through the aid of Harriman, Averill Harriman, the Bonesman, member of the whole Wise Man clique and so forth. He had been looking for a good osteopath while he was the UK ambassador, and osteopathy was not really that big in the UK at the time, but Ward...
Unless anybody doesn't know, because I'm not quite sure myself, what is an osteopath?
It's kind of similar to like a chiropractor, that they also use some amount of massage as well, but kind of something along those lines. Yeah. I was a little foggy on that myself. Obviously, we know a lot about chiropractors now, but not so much about osteopaths as much anymore. But so anyway, it wasn't really big in the UK at the time. Ward then got the call to Harriman. Harriman was impressed with his work. He started introducing him to a lot of his buddies. They included people like Winston Churchill, members of his family, and that was kind of Ward's inroad. But the big score for him was really when he started to make ties with the royal family, and that kind of seems like it was his introduction to this this whole kind of netherworld. Of course, one of his friends was a prominent photographer. He was known as Baron. Can't remember what his actual name was now off the top of my head, but everybody called him Baron. He was the official photographer for the royal family for a time, and the person who had really gotten him this gig was Lord Louis Mountbatten, or Uncle Dickie, as Prince Philip liked to refer to him. Of course, if you followed anything with pedophile scandals in the UK, Mountbatten should raise some serious red flags. He was deeply implicated in Concora and lots of other things. Just a really reprehensible human being on any number of levels. And then, of course, there were some of his relatives that Prince Philip was hanging out with. other members of the Mountbatten family. So all of these guys had kind of become involved in some of these strange sex parties. Barron was known for throwing these specifically. One of the most notable ones, which had partly inspired my cover, was the one that involved women dressed up in Masonic aprons, going around with whips and so forth. There was this kind of weird occult stuff that did appear in that. I mean, obviously, you always kind of wonder if this stuff really is a thing. I mean, can you find serious documentation of it, outside of something like Kathy O'Brien? And that's one of the reasons why Profumo is so intriguing, because it does have a lot of very hard evidence of this kind of stuff, especially when you get into some of the parties that were thrown by another one of Ward's associates. That was Hod Dibbins. Hod had actually been a member of the Plymouth Brethren, the same group of fanatical Christians that Aleister Crowley had belonged to. They certainly do seem to have turned out some rather perverse individuals over the years. Hod had apparently had some kind of come to Jesus moment in the 1930s when he had walked by a neighbor's house. The window blinds were open and he saw his neighbor being whipped. And it's really opened his eyes to the possibilities that the world offered, or something to that effect.
Good times.
Yeah. Hod liked to do some of these weird occult orgies. He also had peacocks, I guess, apparently there. He eventually married a woman, Maria Novikov. I can't remember her last name off the top of my head, but she later had the nickname as the Chief Whip, based on her skills with the whip for the for the cabinet of Harold Macmillan. So there was a lot of really strange stuff like that was going on. Ward, of course, the girls that he procured were largely of age. There were a few women who were around 17 years old, maybe a few 16-year-olds, though he did specifically recruit these women on the basis of their ability to pass as teenagers.
How old was Christine Keeler? Was she 19?
Yeah, I believe she was 18 or 19.
Yeah.
As I've kind of gotten into in the book, I do think that was one of the reasons why the scandal did petrify British society, because even though the girls that Ward was using were mostly legal, there were these kind of connections to people like Mountbatten, the Cray twins, that type of thing, that did sort of shine a light on this underbelly of people who were not of legal age being used in these sex rings.
You talked about something. A point that I think is important here is these kind of like these occult orgies and all this occult symbolism and all this. This is just another way, essentially, of blackmailing somebody, or doing it in a way that will it makes it so unbelievable that it cannot be traced.
Yeah, well, that was something I wanted to emphasize.
That, and it's just kinky shit.
Yeah. And I mean, there's a lot of, I definitely think that there are people who have been involved in these things that took this stuff very seriously. I mean, of course, I think it was Michael Bentine or somebody like that had speculated that Ward's ring was an attempt to recreate the old Hellfire clubs. Maybe it was, it wasn't, but...
That's the early Anglo American Establishment right there.
Oh, yeah.
Benjamin Franklin,
It's okay. So, but the thing about this, though, is I do think that there was, though, a practical reason for this occultism to appear in this stuff. And yes, one of it was for the blackmail purposes in and of itself. I mean, obviously, if you get a politician, certainly a conservative politician involved in a black mass, even if there's, not pretty girls there or something to that effect, it's not going to help his reputation. But I actually think, though, the more pertinent reason as to why this kind of ritualistic trapping was done with some of this stuff was effectively to discredit the victims. Because, that's the thing. Especially in the aftermath of Epstein and Jimmy Savile in the UK and so forth, it's really not that unbelievable to most Americans or Britons anymore that elites do have pedophile rings where they do abuse underage boys and girls. But, you start talking about, capes and black masks and that type of thing, that will almost immediately destroy your credibility. Automatically people will start dismissing you as a kook, which in my opinion is exactly why this stuff is probably done. And it's not, I mean, I'm sure, as I said before, there are people who do take this stuff really seriously, but I think a lot of people who do end up participating in these weird occult themed orgies are probably told that the reason why they're doing it in the first place is to make sure that if any of the people, the kids that are being used for this stuff come forward and start talking about, seeing a pentagram or something like that, they're going to be laughed out of, the courtroom or whatever. So there is a logical reason for this being done. And that's, in a way, it kind of makes it even more insidious.
Now we live in a time where that information in and of itself is weaponized, but that's a whole other issue. Some of the interesting connections that you've made, Stanley Kubrick and Sir Fiel mentioned jokingly Eyes Wide Shut, but I cannot help but think of Eyes Wide Shut when I read this stuff. And I mean, there's scenes that are in the book that you describe that are very, very similar. And you do make the point that Kubrick is kind of hanging out in this kind of milieu at the time. And you also refer to Thomas Corbally and kind of copying the kind of parties and bringing them like to New York City that were going on in London. And like stuff like the Cotton Club murders. So let's talk a little bit about that and what kind of because I think Kubrick knew something.
Yeah, that was very much the sense I got researching a lot of this too. I do think that, yes, he was definitely dropping hints and Eyes Wide Shut about, these rings that kind of originated in the UK. And then, as you kind of alluded to, Corbally at least claimed that he was the one that had brought this type of stuff over to the United States in I think it was like, the mid-60s or something like that. But basically this weird S&M scene with the, these theatrics and so forth. And a lot of this stuff was taking place in these isolated mansions, out in the middle of nowhere in New York State, outside of the city, very much what Tom Cruise kind of experiences in Eyes Wide Shut when he's invited to one of these parties, or I should say crashes one of these parties more likely.
Right.
But yeah, and that's sort of where the whole Cotton Club thing came into play. Of course, that took place in Long Island. I think it was the Hampshires or something to that effect, and involved Roy Radin. Radin, of course, had first gained notoriety because of the whole incident with Monica Heller. She was an actress who had attended one of these parties, and she had claimed effectively that she had been raped, and I believe filmed also while this was going on, and that had caused a major scandal. And it later came out many, many years later that Corbally was actually the one who had blown the whistle effectively on what was going on with Radin. And he had done this because, kind of as Christopher Knowles has alluded to with this type of stuff, the problems start to emerge when the amateurs start getting in on the act. And that kind of seems to have been Corbally's mentality. Corbally was part of the responsible S&M clique or some such shit, who knew limits that should not be passed. And Radin and, these Johnny-come-latelys had just started to get a little too weird. They were starting to bring public attention to all the stuff that was going on at these mansions. And that wasn't a good thing. Of course, Radin later turned up in the Cotton Club murders. Of course, Cotton Club was a movie that Francis Ford Coppola directed that the infamous producer Robert Evans was involved with. They had been trying to get this off the ground. Radin, because of his extracurricular activities, which probably involved drug trafficking, had some cash. Later, though, he was double-crossed by some of his other investors, and he ended up dead, and I believe it was 1983, and of course, that whole death has led to much speculation over the years. Of course, there's a lot of thoughts that it was tied in with the Process Church, the Final Judgment, and the Manson killings. Of course, his murderer, the man was later convicted for his murder, was William Mincer, I believe is how his last name was pronounced. Maury Terry had alluded to as being the infamous Manson 2.
Yeah, I was about to ask you if that was in The Ultimate Evil. Yeah.
So yeah, it kind of ties into all that, and that's certainly something that I'll look much closer at in one of the later books. But that just kind of gives you a scope of how weird this stuff kind of gets. I mean, of course, The co-founder of the Process Church, the Final Judgment, Mary Ann de Grimstone, was rumored for many years to have been one of World's Awards girls back in the day. So, there are these kind of long-standing connections that might have been present. And then, of course, Robert de Grimstone had been an officer in the British Army before he had gotten into all the Scientology stuff and what have you. So that raises a lot of interesting possibilities as well.
Well, I realized that by reading this, and this is going to sound silly, but like Monty Python used to make a fun of a lot of this kind of stuff. Like they did a lot of jokes about dominatrixes and especially like East End gangsters and stuff.
I'm only really familiar with Holy Grail and The Life of Brian. I haven't actually watched too much of the show, but I'll take your word for it.
Yeah, this would have been in the Flying Circus.
Okay. And I can definitely see it, but that has been, I think kind of going back to at least Profumo, it was kind of known that this was the sort of, kinky stuff that the British establishment got up to.
So let's go through the kind of the details of the Profumo Affair. Like what happened with that?
Well, obviously it revolved around a figure named John Profumo. He was a member of Harold Macmillan's cabinet, who at the time when the affair started was the prime minister. The other big player was the woman you had alluded to earlier, Christine Keeler, a showgirl, quote unquote. And the other big figure was Yuri Ivanov, the Soviet military attaché and also an agent of the GRU, which was the Soviet Union's principal military intelligence service, and it still is Russia's principal military intelligence service to this day. The affair had really got going at a house party in 1961 that was held at a location known as Cliveden that was owned by the Astor family, the famous Anglo American Astor family, whose fortune had originally been built on opium smuggling. So anyway, the party was also, of course, in the honor of Lord Mountbatten, so he was present at this as well. Appropriate figure to be stationed there for what would later unfold, I suppose. So anyway, Keeler would initially have an affair with Ivanov and then later with Profumo. And that created some issues, to put it mildly, because now you had a senior cabinet minister who was having an affair with a woman who was also sleeping with a Soviet spy, though Ivanov and Keeler would later insist that they only slept together once. Though I guess Keeler has changed her story, or did change her story on multiple occasions with that. But it's generally agreed, I guess, that they only slept together once. But anyway, regardless if it was only that one time, this did create some pretty major security concerns, and that was really the basis of the scandal, which ultimately brought down Harold Macmillan's government in 1963 when it started to finally break in the press. That would have been towards the end of 1962, and it really got going in 63.
So your idea here is that this was really some kind of honeypot situation, that this was kind of set up and meant to bring the Macmillan government down?
Well, originally, I think it was simply meant to entrap Ivanov, and then it was only later that it was, seen as opportunistic way of bringing down Macmillan's government. One of the things I sort of got into in the book was that, at the same time this was unfolding, Julian Amery was trying to set up his whole operation in Yemen, which was just pivotal for British foreign policy going forward. This is something I got into in my earlier book, Strange Tales, the Parapolitical. But effectively, Amery and his buddy, Colonel David Sterling, the co-founder of the Special Air Services, these were basically the two men who created the modern private military industry with WatchGuard International. And this had grown out of the Yemen operation that Amery was setting up. And effectively, they came up with this whole means where you would use British troops who were no longer part of the British military, mercenaries, in other words, British arms, and you would get another party, in this case, the House of Saud, to fund what were effectively British operations. It totally had almost no ties whatsoever to what Macmillan was doing. And the British government, and this made it very controversial. Amery was Macmillan's son-in-law to boot, but he was ultimately a diehard British imperialist, and having devised a effective way to maintain British power without actually working through the British government, it does not seem that his father-in-law was going to be allowed to stand in his way to implement these policies. And that is essentially the premise of why I think the Profumo Affair was eventually leaked to the press in '63.
That's I always just looked at this as just some kind of just weird sex scandal, but to see that there's a whole hell of a lot more to it is extremely fascinating.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that's one of the problems really with a lot of the researchers looking at Profumo is they tended to just focus on the affair itself and not kind of the broader geopolitical situation that was unfolding in the US and the UK at the time. And I think that's, why nobody's ever really been able to satisfactorily explain like what the motives were behind the leakage eventually in '63, until my book was published anyway.
Right. Exactly.
And in addition to some of these people and their families and children being involved later with the Epstein stuff, you were also kind of like insinuating that this type of operation might have been part of what was behind the Epstein stuff as well.
Well, yeah. I mean, I think, it is very much a legacy. And I mean, I do think there is something of a direct lineage. I mean, obviously that's, going to be unfolded gradually over the course of the next couple of books. But, I kind of had laid the foundation, though, by going into the Mayfair set and this particular book. And that will definitely be crucial going forward to kind of understand how this, kind of brownstone ring, these brownstone operations and the ring that was sponsoring them has kind of passed down, seemingly for several generations now. And Epstein ended up as a player in it, at least by the 1980s.
Yeah, what was the Mayfair set?
Well, they were a group of businessmen and so forth, ex-soldiers and what have you, that would meet at a gaming establishment known as the Claremont Club. Sometimes they're also, for that reason, known as the Claremont set. Adam Curtis actually did quite an excellent documentary series on them. I think it came out in 2000, aptly titled The Mayfair Set. Some of the big figures included Sir James Goldsmith, Tiny Rowland, of course, the founder of the club, Joe Aspinall, who was a fanatical eugenicist, a very interesting character, as were many of the other guys involved with the Mayfair set. They started to gain a lot of notoriety in the late 60s, early 70s, when several members showed up in rather prominent roles in attempts to destabilize the British government, which will definitely be a major point of emphasis in the second book. So these guys got into some pretty heavy parapolitics, and one of them specifically, Sir James Goldsmith, is just really crucial to a lot of what would unfold in the UK in the 21st century, because I mean, he was really the first major figure to put a lot of financial support behind the UK leaving the EU. He was the first individual to found a political party in the 90s that was totally based on the UK departing the EU, and a lot of his, former associates and even his son-in-law would later become major financial supporters of Brexit. So Goldsmith, Brexit is very much Goldsmith's legacy, and he was involved in a lot of other stuff that's very relevant to Epstein as well.
I want to hit a little bit about the SOE.
Oh, sure.
And like you are setting it up for Robert Maxwell, because he is part of the SOE.
Yeah. Well, I mean, kind of the, old boys network. I mean, obviously in the US, we had the OSS old boys. In the UK, they had the SOE old boys. The special operations executive, like I kind of alluded to earlier, I mean, this was, essentially what, as the title implies, did the kind of covert operations for the UK during the Second World War. If you wanted to assassinate someone or blow up a bridge or that type of thing, I mean, the SOE is who handled these operations. So they would become very instrumental in the post-war years with a lot of coups and that type of thing. And certainly they did play a pretty significant role in Robert Maxwell's early development. One of the big figures in the SOE was Sir Charles Hambro, a member of the storied banking dynasty. Very, very powerful figure in the British establishment for many years. I mean, he'd also been a director of the Bank of England, I think, by the time he was only like 35 or something to that effect. And of course, the Hambro family just, they were a pivotal banking dynasty for many, many years in the UK, and they still wield a lot of influence. Anyway, Maxwell, Hambro was also deeply involved in a lot of scientific espionage, and specifically trying to get nuclear secrets and that type of thing from the Nazi regime in the aftermath of the war, and then later trying to keep tabs effectively on what the Soviets were up to. And one of the methods that they kind of devised for this was scientific journals. It was always great to mine open source material. There usually are a lot of possibilities for that. And that had led to them setting up a company, was it Butterworth Springer, that was kind of a combination of a German firm and a British one. It was not very financially successful, though they did have a managing director who had shown a lot of talent, and that was a certain Robert Maxwell. After the German partners had decided to back out, effectively, the decision was made to let Maxwell buy it. And he had no money really at the time. Hambro gave him a tremendous loan to purchase this. It was something like £25,000, which during this time, I think it would have been like 1951 or something like that, was a tremendous amount of money, especially since the UK was still devastated from the war. So Maxwell ended up as head of this journal, and eventually he turned it into Pergamon Press, which was his flagship for many, many years. It became one of the leading scientific journals in the entire world, and Maxwell eventually procured an almost near monopoly on Soviet scientific publications, which is a big part of why Pergamon became so phenomenally successful. But he was, almost totally set up at this company by Hambro. And throughout the 1950s, he was surrounded by both Hambro and a lot of these other, old special operations executive hands. And, this is really interesting because Maxwell had established links with the British intelligence service and the Soviet Union, one of the predecessors to the KGB, going back to the just really immediate aftermath of the Second World War. And then going into 1954, he flew into the Soviet Union. He had major meetings with members of the KGB. And that was essentially when he got the rights for these, Soviet scientific publications after he had made some kind of arrangement with the KGB. Came back to the UK. MI5 was understandably kind of concerned about this. And MI6 did have some doubts as well. They brought in Maxwell's secretary, Ann Dove, who he had also been having an affair with, to vouch for his loyalty. And Dove was a part of this whole, kind of special operations nexus. She had worked for them during the Second World War. And it was largely through her good graces that they decided to continue working with Maxwell. So basically, you had this kind of whole network of ex-special operations hands who had put Maxwell in power, and they had continued to protect him even after it was known that he was collaborating with the KGB in some capacity.
Yeah, and here's your direct connection to Epstein, because it is Robert Maxwell's daughter, Ghislaine, who is Epstein's girlfriend and partner in crime.
Yes. And I mean, it's important to note, too, that Hambro was was a big figure in setting up the World Commerce Corporation, this whole sort of nexus that I think Julian Amery had eventually grown out of in the 1950s. So, that's kind of where you also see the sort of genesis, I think, of these honeypots and so forth as well. Maxwell and Amery, were kind of polar opposites. Maxwell was labor, though a lot of labor politicians had suspected him of being a closet Tory because of his longstanding ties to people like Hambro. And on the other hand, you did have people like Amery, but they ultimately were a part of this kind of private black intelligence network that was so powerful in the UK in the aftermath of the Second World War.
So there is another interesting connection that you make to Resorts International with some of these same guys.
Yeah, Resorts is very interesting. Obviously talked a lot about Resorts over the last couple of years, ever since Trump really came into office, which I'll get to in a second. But the most pertinent connection to Profumo and Resorts is William Mellon Hitchcock. He was a scion of the Mellon family of Pittsburgh, one of the great American dynasties. William Mellon Hitchcock is most well known for his role in spreading LSD in the country. He was an early patron of Timothy Leary. He set Leary up at his estate at Millbrook in New York State. And then later, after he booted Leary out, Mr. Billy would relocate to the West Coast and would become the financier for the Brotherhood of Eternal Love, which by the late 1960s had become the largest LSD syndicate in the entire world. So Mr. Billy did quite a bit to turn on America during the 1960s, but before he got going on that, he was living in the UK at a flat. His roommate was Thomas Corbally, infamous private detective we were talking about earlier. They were throwing
the one that did all the one that had all the safe words, right?
Yeah, all the safe words, all that kind of stuff. So anyway, they've got this flat in the UK. They're throwing orgies and stuff like that on the weekends or something to that effect. Naturally, they eventually befriended Stephen Ward because they were all into that kind of stuff. Yeah. So anyway, Mr. Billy becomes a friend of Ward's, later provides some testimony about all the hanky-panky that was going on to his former in-law, David Bruce, who was the American ambassador at the time. And then he would leave the UK to his adventures in LSD land. And by the late 1960s, he would become one of the largest investors in the gaming interest known as Resorts International. Resorts was based originally out of the Bahamas. On Paradise Island. It had formerly been Hog Island. It was turned into Paradise Island by Huntington Hartford, who had also been a member of the ring that was unfolding with Ward in the UK during the early 60s. Obviously, Resorts, it became a major gaming interest there. It really opened up the Bahamas to that type of thing. And Mr. Billy, he was right there with some other interesting figures. Richard Nixon was reportedly a early investor as well in Resorts, and also potentially got a cut of the skim from the toll bridge that brought people from the main Bahama Islands over to Paradise Island. He was also not the only Republican president who would eventually have ties to Resorts International either. During the 1980s, a certain Donald J. Trump would become the CEO of Resorts International, while it still had a lot of these mobbed up interests and so forth.
Yeah, it's wow.
What a web.
It really truly is. It really truly is. And Roy Cohn seems to just pop up everywhere.
Yeah. Well, I mean, of course, Cohn was one of the big political mentors to Thomas Corbally, and Cohn employed Corbally for many years as a private detective, which is interesting. I mean, Corbally obviously shows up in Profumo. He shows up in the whole, weird Long Island, upstate New York sex circles that were exposed with the Monica Heller thing in 1980. And later in the early 90s, he showed up in the Heidi Fleiss scandal in Hollywood, which also involved Robert Evans as well, who was apparently a longtime friend of Corbally's. So Corbally certainly had an uncanny knack for showing up in these sexual blackmail rings, which, again, is interesting with all of the rumors floating around for many years about Roy Cohn and what he was up to. And thought in mind that Corbally was his private detective for many, many years. And Corbally also later provided these services to Donald J. Trump, as well as Sir Jimmy Goldsmith.
I mean, do you think that, if you had to kind of speculate, do you think that there is any kind of, this kind of stuff that might have Trump by the balls? This kind of, this kind of honeypot kind of stuff? I mean, we all know the stories. I mean,
Yeah, I mean, I think it's quite possible. I mean, it's, definitely really interesting that you haven't really seen much with Ghislaine after that she was, arrested earlier this year. But I mean, I kind of think at this point in time, I mean, Epstein ultimately had much more extensive ties to the Democratic Party. And of course, it's not really talked about a lot now, but Trump was a Democrat for many, many, many years.
That's true. That's true.
So, yeah, I think you haven't really heard more of this because really Trump would go down, I think, if Ghislaine started talking. And so would much of the party establishment of the Democrats with him. So it's a bit of a stalemate, I think, on that end.
Well, it seems like things like this might be to, get people from both sides on board with larger agendas.
Yeah, I mean, you definitely see a lot of overlap with that, certainly. But yeah, I mean, it is a mess. Let's just say that. It's definitely going to be interesting to see how this potentially plays out. Whenever the 2020 election is finally over with, that may not be for a couple more weeks, if not months, based on Trump's comments during the first presidential debate.
So, Profumo Affair is October 1963 is when it really breaks. And of course, the JFK assassination is November of that year, the next month. Is there some connection that you would kind of speculate between the two?
Oh, absolutely. Well, I mean, there's been some very compelling evidence that's come out over the years that Kennedy himself had actually been ensnared in Ward's ring. By not one, but two girls specifically. One of them was Hod Dibben's wife, Parliament's chief whip. And then another one was an Asian woman known as Susie Chang, who incidentally had been assisted in fleeing the United States for a time by the law firm that William Donovan had been a partner in. Of course, Bill Donovan was an early supporter of the World Commerce Corporation back in the day. But that was also why I think ultimately Profumo was such a major red flag here in the United States. Because it also brought up the possibility that Kennedy might have also been implicated in a ring that theoretically the Soviet intelligence services had penetrated. So that was another major factor, and there has been speculation as to how much that might have also played into Kennedy's assassination. I mean, there were a lot of factors that went into Kennedy's assassination. I don't think that Profumo was one of them. It may not have even been a leading one, but certainly that was something that almost surely would have proved to be extremely damaging to Kennedy going forward. And the reason for that was the private detective we were just talking about, Mr. Thomas Corbally. It does seem that Corbally had gone to the UK and had made an effort to befriend Ward specifically to find out if the rumors were true that Kennedy was implicated in this ring. The FBI had heard rumblings of that going back to 1961 when the affair that Kennedy had supposedly happened. Roy Cohn was a very, very good friend of J. Edgar Hoover's. And when Thomas Corbally returned to the United States in 1963, he made a beeline to the FBI and started telling them what he had heard over in the UK. And his attorney for this was Roy Cohn. So it's quite likely that Hoover, who utterly despised the Kennedys, and especially Robert Kennedy, was aware of Kennedy's and JFK's involvement in the Profumo ring, or the Ward ring, rather, and would have almost surely used that against him, since Hoover and Roy Cohn were both effectively fighting for their political lives at the time against Robert Kennedy's Justice Department.
So this idea that kind of like Kennedy was probably kind of compromised by Russian intelligence, and the idea that possibility that there was a push to maybe get Kennedy to resign because of that, kind of similar to what happened with Macmillan with Profumo.
Yeah. I mean, I do think, and then of course there was another scandal too. Bobby Baker, who was a close associate. I think it was Bobby Baker. one of LBJ's close associates had also been getting girls for Kennedy, and there was also some belief that one of them might have been involved with Soviet intelligence as well. So, I mean, really, Kennedy was getting it from both sides. And yeah, I do think kind of behind the scenes, that was one of the methods that was being used to put pressure on JFK going forward. I mean, obviously, it was well known that he was a womanizer. I mean, the FBI had already had dirt on that for many years, but when you bring a Soviet spy into the equation, it's a whole different ballgame, effectively.
I'm really curious to see where this goes and how you ultimately connect it all to more recent events in the Epstein material.
I mean, a lot of it is going to run through Sir James Goldsmith, but a big point of emphasis in the second book is going to be Le Cercle, which, I mean, if you followed my blog or ISGP or anyone who's really followed that, you are probably aware that Le Cercle has been deeply implicated in various sex rings really across the world. Members show up in the Jimmy Savile stuff. They show up in the stuff with Marc Dutroux in Belgium, show up in the Franklin scandal here, and they even show up in Bloody Colonia Dignidad in Chile. So the Cercle people got around, that was for sure, and that will definitely be a major point of emphasis in the next book.
Today, at this time period, is there anything that people that you would think that are maybe involved in these type of operations? Like, do you think that this is, well, I couldn't help but think of like Elliot Spitzer. You know, what happened with him, and that wasn't that long ago.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think Roger Stone might have been, you know, kind of a successor to Roy Cohn in that regard. I mean, of course, it's not really talked about a lot, but Roger Stone had actually had some involvement with Nexium going back to the last decade. He'd been their attorney for a time. So, I mean, you have kind of that whole nexus. And then, of course, Stone was the guy who had really outed Spitzer's affair with a prostitute as well. So, at a minimum, it does kind of seem like Stone was a guy who was keeping tabs on this kind of stuff. And, you know, it's interesting in light of the fact that he was also one of the people that was really singled out for prosecution as well after Trump came into power. So, yeah, you got to wonder about that, along with his partner, was it Manafort, who was also singled out. I mean, both of these guys, you know, I mean, they had cut their teeth working with Roy Cohn back in the 70s, early 80s. So, you know, were they aware of some of the stuff that Cohn and Corbally were up to and had possibly brought it into the modern era? I mean, that is a good question. And certainly it is interesting in light of the fact that these were two guys who faced a lot of legal heat after Trump came to office, along with Michael Flynn, who certainly had his own elaborate intelligence ties as well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, do you think that Ranieri was the Nexium leader? Do you think that he was running some of this? Do you think that he was running something similar to this?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, Ranieri, I mean, there's just so many things with Nexium, you know, that I mean are just really staggering, you know, that haven't really been addressed. I mean, one thing that is very ominous were the ties that Nexium had to the LeBaron family in Mexico. The LeBarons are a big Mormon family. I mean, going way back, they might have even had some links to the Romney family and so forth, but certainly major figures. And one of the patriarchs of the LeBaron family in Mexico, gosh, I can't remember his name now, but I mean, he's kind of referred to as the Mormon Manson. I mean, this guy had his family members kill quite a considerable amount of people. I think it's like 20, something between like 20 and 30 people or something like that. But anyway, the LeBaron family were one of the Mormon groups that were providing girls to Nexium in Mexico. And that's really interesting in light of geopolitical events that unfolded in Mexico in 2019. Of course, you had the 9 Americans with dual Mexican citizenship that were murdered in Mexico. They were all linked to the LeBaron family, if not actual members of it. And the LeBarons would later use that incident to rally Trump to designate the Mexican cartels as terrorist organizations so that the U.S. military, aka the Joint Special Operations Command, could be deployed there to go after them. And if you know anything really about the history of Mexico, having U.S. troops deployed there is a very, very sensitive thing for them. So, yeah, it's very interesting that you have this prominent Mormon family that has been really at the forefront of lobbying for this, who had these ties to Nexium.
Well, also, too, Raniere he had one of the sons of a former president that was a devotee. And Raniere, when he was caught, was in Mexico. He was in Monterrey.
Yeah, no, I mean, the Mexican tie to this has been really downplayed, and I think a lot of it has to do, at least in part, with the ties that he had to these, fundamentalist Mormon families. Because, I mean, all of the Mormon families down there are big into polygamy, and, again, if you followed this kind of stuff, these families have lots of kids, and sometimes those kids just kind of go missing, Yeah, there's a lot of speculation about sometimes what they end up doing.
Wow. Another one that I can think of historically, which, in the last probably like 30, 40 years, is David Berg and Children of God.
Oh, yeah, that's another one.
There had to have been some stuff going on with that. Because he had those women convinced that they were, prostituting themselves as a form of proselytization, and I think that there's definitely, you could definitely say that there's some kind of speculation of like bringing some kind of and like the religious cult aspect, like connections and stuff like the People's Temple. You could easily see something like that.
The Process Church.
The Process, yeah.
And that's another interesting one too, because again, the Process, there's been a lot of denials over the years from ex-Process members about many of the more sensational allegations. But one thing they do not deny was the horrendous treatment of the children that were sired by Process members. Often they were taken away from their biological parents. They were sent to orphanages or something to that effect that the Process was running. In many cases, they would rarely, if ever, see their parents again. In many cases, they were subjected to horrendous abuse at these orphanages, and sometimes they would just disappear. Nobody would know what happened to them.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's interesting how this kind of racket unfolds. It's kind of a funny thing. Of course, I'm sure you guys are aware of the Process Church eventually became the Best Friends Animal Society.
Yes.
They're right there at the border of Utah and Arizona, about 30 or 40 minutes away across the border in Arizona. There's a city called Colorado City, which is pretty much a theocracy run by fundamentalist Mormons. They control the police force, everything there. It was headed by many years and allegedly still is by Warren Jeffs, who is currently in prison for statutory rape of multiple minors. Jeffs apparently had ranches all across the West where he would go to indulge in these things with underage women. And it's kind of happened to be right there in the same vicinity as the Best Friends Animal Society. So that's weird, huh?
Yeah, what's up with all the breakaway Mormon sects? This is totally new to me. I've not heard this before, Stephen.
I only really started to look at it recently, but yeah, you kind of see them showing up in these weird places like that. I had been somewhat aware of this for years because of their, kind of overlap with Christian identity. Of course, as you guys are probably aware, I've followed that for many years, but that's something my research assistant and I, Keith Allen Dennis, have been chronicling. Of course, we're obsessed with this this kind of quasi-secret society called the Sovereign Order.
Well, like a secret society, I would just say, or like the Italian mafia or whoever. It's a very, they can be very coherent orderly groups.
These like fundamentalist Mormon sects, I mean, they really do, in a lot of cases, operate like crime syndicates. I mean, again, going back to the LeBaron family in Mexico, I mean, one of the branches of that family had this massive illegal car ring that they were like running, between the U.S. and Mexico. And so a lot of them do get involved in criminal activity along with this, kind of weird stuff with having children and losing them, that kind of thing.
They were kind of used to the outlaw lifestyle in a way, from the frontier, from their conflicts with the federal government. So, once the official church went mainstream, you could see how especially some of these splinter groups would go off to, get involved in all kinds of weird stuff.
Yeah, well, they're also very important in Mexico too for U.S. influence, because most of the Mormon families in Mexico, they're in northern Mexico. They have dual U.S. Mexico citizenship, and many of them are quite prominent there. And for many years, they've been used as a tool of U.S. foreign policy, effectively. I mean, if you know much about the history of Mexico, a lot of the modern government was effectively created from the north by a lot of the Freemasons and what have you there, and a lot of it was really being driven by these ties with the Masons in the United States and the Mormon communities and so forth. So it gets into some really, really weird stuff, to put it mildly.
Oh yeah.
Another one that I can think of would be something like the Finders case.
Yeah, that's another one. And I believe that also had a role in Mexico, too.
That's right. It did. Yeah.
Finders are another weird one. My colleague John Brisson is working on a book on that, which hopefully will be out soon. It's definitely going to have some very good stuff on the Finders.
Yeah, as weird as that case is, it's still like 100% true. The thing is that all those kind of weird cases like that have been used by groups like QAnon now to like establish that all this stuff is like, it's always that little bit of truth mixed in,
Yeah. I mean, it's that whole kind of CCRU thing of hyperstition, theory fiction, that kind of blending of fiction with reality, which, can prove to be quite potent, obviously in the case of QAnon.
Well, Stephen, Recluse, this has been fascinating. The book is out now, I believe, right?
Yes, sir, it is.
So where can people find it? And where can people contact you if they have any information?
Well, they can contact me at my blog. There is a contact thing there. It is visupview.blogspot.com. That is VISUP, view, all one word, .blogspot.com. The book is available at the Farm's official store. The address for that is the Farm Podcast, all one word, the farmpodcast.store. And you can also find links to it at my blog as well. Currently, it's only available as an ebook. We are going to get the physical copy out probably in time for Christmas, but definitely, don't let that dissuade you from picking up an ebook in the interim. So yeah, check that out. And obviously, I've got my podcast, the Farm Podcast, which we're getting a great roster of guests, thanks in no small part to you guys.
Thank you.
Yeah. Just about to have David Metcalf on, Robert Guffey, Erica Lukes, and of course we've already had a lot of great people. I just had Blue Oyster Cult's Albert Bouchard on, Peter Robbins, Richard B. Spence, Douglas Valentine. Of course, I've had Chris Knowles on a number of times, Jason Horsley, John Bevel-Aqua. So, I think it's turned into a pretty solid podcast. So definitely check me out there sometime when you get a chance as well.
Yeah, I highly recommend it. And also thank you for helping us hook up with Richard Spence as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
So.
That will have been last week when this comes out.
All right, cool. Well, if there's nothing to add, we will go ahead and close out the interview. And guys, we'll be back to close out the show on Conspirinormal. Okay, welcome back, guys, to Conspirinormal. We're going to close out the show here. And that was a very interesting interview with our good friend Recluse, Mr. Stephen Snider. We kind of...
waiting on this book for a while, and we are surprised to see that it is going to be a part 1 of 3.
Yes.
So this is just laying the entire groundwork for even, I guess, understanding all of the different connections he's going to be going into to eventually end up at the, who knows, what might be like the genesis of the Epstein scandal itself.
Yeah, and, stay tuned, guys. I'm sure in 2021 we're going to have him back on at least a couple of times to talk about the next 2 books, so I would definitely stay tuned for that. I was pretty impressed. There's a lot of detail in these books, so when you get these, you're going to be bombarded with a lot of names and a lot of different connections.
And a lot of notes and a lot of references to cross-reference everything he's presenting.
Yeah, exactly.
The things that really interest me are like the basic things that you can accomplish, the utility of something like having a sex club or a ring for these powerful people. So like we can brainstorm on all the types of things you could do. You could blackmail the other side or people in another country maybe that you needed to get on board with something going on in your country, or it could be like a domestic thing for political opposition in your own country. You can blackmail both sides for a larger goal, so that would be on maybe both sides of different countries or political parties, something like that. You could create more cohesion and a bonding experience, with
and a bondage experience,
and a bondage experience with some kind of belonging to this this group, this permissive elitist group that you share with other people, and then too, actual magic. There's a lot of possibility for that, and even some weird kind of initiatory thing that leads to more cohesion and bonding. What do you think about what else you could? Is there anything else you could think of for like what else you could accomplish with something like that?
Well, I think like you said, I think just the blackmail. It's an extremely powerful tool. We're talking about a very primal urge, right? You can just about get anybody in some kind of compromising position. So I guess the advice for everybody out there is start your own kind of like sex club, or even better, your own kind of sex cult. And you got it made.
What do you think about the mixing of these clubs and occult trappings or ritualistic garb or those kind of things?
Yeah, that's interesting. Again, I think we're dealing with the same kind of what came first, the chicken and egg kind of idea that we've got with like secret societies and intelligence agencies. So is that, well, first of all, is it a mockery of secret societies and kind of what secret societies might hold dear? Or are you actually trying to bring something new into the secret society? Kind of like, I think Stephen mentioned the Hellfire Club. There's a lot of that going on in the Hellfire Club. Is this some kind of like weird fertility cult kind of stuff that you're mixing in? And then also,
and how much is just fun too?
Right,
people feel
right.
like they're being naughty. Might as well turn up a notch and draw some pentagrams on the floor. And
right. We were when we first saw the cover of the book, we thought it was very interesting cover. It's basically got a girl, like, I don't know if she's tied to a chair, but she's sitting in a chair, and you've got like two, like, topless women wearing Masonic aprons. And we just thought it was such an over the top cover, but apparently, according to Steven, that's the type of stuff that happened in these. So,
he speculates that, like, doing stuff with these occult trappings would discredit victims or witnesses? Like when they spoke about it, it just seemed crazy?
Yeah. But again, I mean, is that because they actually, but you also have to deal with the fact that maybe there's people that actually believe in this stuff too.
Well, yeah, I mean, was there actual sex magic?
Yeah. Yeah. I'd say that there definitely was in some of these things. I mean, I think it's pretty hard to tell. But then maybe the outcome is still the same for like the authorities. If they're listening to this story, they might think it's so outlandish that it's not possibly real. So no matter what the motive, the outcome may still be the same anyway.
Yeah, and then I think
that's entirely possible.
Then we touched on in the Patreon maybe how much a lot of this kind of stuff, though it may exist in the U.S., a lot of it seems really uniquely British, and that the prevalence of it in the United States seems to be where the United States is really linked to the UK and what's called the Anglo American Establishment. So it's kind of seems to be kind of culturally specific too.
Yeah. And then you have the whole Thomas Corbally that he mentions that tried to copy it in the US and all this type of thing. It's interesting stuff. Very interesting. Was there anything else that we wanted to kind of touch on that?
No, just how, the stuff that he touches on in this book is all, most of it is historical fact that can be cross-referenced. I guess unless it's a lot of these are witness accounts, so, who knows? It seems that a lot of this stuff that's a lot more real is mined by a lot of conspiracy theory that may not be real.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So it's always important to know the difference, and unfortunately, that's usually time that allows that.
Yes. I mean, we're talking about historic events. Now, as we get closer, I think for Stephen, he's going to get closer into the Epstein stuff. I mean, there's probably a lot of stuff that we already do not know about all that. So only time is going to really tell the depth of that, I think. So like with this material in this book, a lot of these people are dead. He can go back and find these interesting, strange connections. But that's going to be, I think, radically different by the time we get to part 3. So I don't know. There may be a little more speculation in that book, possibly. But I'm looking forward to both, and we're looking forward to interviewing Stephen on both books as well. So in closing out this episode, we actually did get a review from a listener that calls themselves the Fathoms of Fortiana.
Oh, shit.
And they said, been following Adam and crew. Of course I would. Been following Adam and crew, moment of silence for Luke and his population control rhetoric. So that goes way back.
Dang.
Since the inception of the podcast, found him through Dr. Future. I love the way they will tackle any subject and make it interesting. Episode 338 was mind-bending. Give them a listen, sub, and discuss. Which episode 338 was the one about mimetic warfare with Jose Herrera. And the title of this is Conspirinormal Promotes Critical Thinking.
Wow. All right.
So
we'll take that.
Yeah, we will definitely take that. And that was a 5-star review. And
Thank you.
That definitely helps us. And you hear this on probably every podcast that you listen to. That definitely helps us get up in the algorithms on iTunes and get up the chart. So if you want to help us out, that's another way that you can. Plus, you can go to Patreon, and Sergio, you can tell where they can find that.
On patreon.com/Conspirinormal. We've got a big announcement on that coming really soon. We're just waiting on some merch to be manufactured as we speak. And we hope to bring a lot of extra stuff to you on Patreon. We had a little segment with Recluse after the show tonight. And we talked about, Clan Fraser, another one of the groups in this book with all these different scandals, as well as Alexander Gaterma, who showed up in the Penny Royal podcast and in our segments with the creators of the Penny Royal podcast. So things like that are coming out every week on patreon.com/Conspirinormal, and we're going to have a new set of benefits to the different Patreon tiers coming up soon.
Yes, we will. So be ready for that announcement. And also, you can go to YouTube, subscribe to us on Conspirinormal Podcast. That also helps us out there. And I think that's pretty much all the announcements. So, all right, guys, I want to thank you all for listening. And we will be back to bring you some great weird stuff next week on Conspirinormal.
If you would like to help the show, please consider becoming a Patreon at www.patreon.com/Conspirinormal. Or leave a one-time donation at Conspirinormal.com. And please check out our YouTube channel